Today, we'll be discussing his latest book, a magisterial biography of an often overlooked character in Indian history, which is Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Welcome, Manu, sir, to our podcast.
He saw my face and then he sort of tapped the book pointedly and said, Madame Pandit, Madame Pandit. So you're absolutely right that in that book, she sort of leapt off of the page because of her character, her wit, like the things that she would say, her charm. She ultimately clashes with her niece, Indira Gandhi.
And you mentioned quite in detail about Motilal Nehru as well, which I feel is also somewhat missing in many chapters of history.
Gandhi, in comparison to these other figures, is not impressive to her at all. She writes letters to her very good friend, Padmaja Naidu, who's Sarojini's daughter. I think it's wrong to say she didn't have a formal education. Private tutors was like the most elite form of education possible. So she's warm, she's funny, she's part-tongued, it's true, but her goal is to kind of win people over, not to just sort of destroy them verbally.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the latest episode of the Coffee House Experience. Our guest today is Professor Manu Bhagavan of the Hunter College, University of New York. Manu is a specialist on modern India, focusing on 20th century, late colonial and post-colonial periods, with particular interest in human rights, internationalism, and questions of sovereignty. At Hunter, where he's a professor of history at the undergraduate level, he lectures on modern world history and on modern South Asian history, and offers seminars on Gandhi, modern India, and violence and ethnic conflict. Today, we'll be discussing his latest book, a magisterial biography of an often overlooked character in Indian history, which is Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. Welcome, Manu, sir, to our podcast.
Thank you, Srinjoy. It's a pleasure to be here, and nice to meet you and Souvik as well.
Yep.
Nice to meet you.
So I think before we delve into the book, we just want to understand your motivations around writing this book. So we know from your trajectory that you have worked on India's role in the Cold War in your past scholarly treatises, and you were drawn to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit and her diplomatic contributions during the Cold War. Was this book an offshoot of your interest in her diplomatic contributions, or were you interested in her specifically as a character who had not been well etched out in the scholarly work covering that period of India?
The answer is yes to both of those things. My interest in her predates my work on the Cold War or my last book, The Peacemakers. And actually, she's the point of departure for both of those things. What happened is I was sitting in my office at Hunter College, and my friend, my buddy, my colleague, walked by and walked into my office and presented me with a book he had just written on basically the United States and world affairs. And he handed it to me, and he was sort of beaming with pride. And as he handed it to me, he said, I would be particularly interested in this book. And I was very happy for him and all of that, but I couldn't quite understand why I would be particularly interested in a book on America and world affairs, because it's not what I work on. But he saw my face, and then he sort of tapped the book pointedly and said, Madame Pandit, Madame Pandit. And I kind of stared at him blankly because I didn't know who he was talking about. And I just sort of nodded politely and said, thank you, and I'll look at it. And it took me a minute to realize he was talking about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit to begin with. And then I sort of felt deeply embarrassed because I was like, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, why would she be in this book? And what does she have to do with any of this? And I was, other than the fact that she was Nehru's sister, I was like, I really don't know anything about her. And so I was like, why is she important enough? So I sat with my embarrassment. I felt very embarrassed, and embarrassment can be very useful. if you take it as a sign that there are things that you should know that you don't, and you're willing to sort of learn about it. So I set about trying to read some things about her, feeling, again, that I should know something that I don't. But I was very surprised to learn that there was really nothing about her. She really wasn't much more than a footnote in most works. So then I looked at his book, and it turned out, lo and behold, she did some amazing things. So at any rate, that set me on, that kind of got my mind thinking about some things. And as I was doing research for my next project, I wound up using her papers, and that led to The Peacemakers, in which she featured as a prominent character. So you're absolutely right that in that book, she sort of leapt off of the page because of her character, her wit, like the things that she would say, her charm, but also she was an important diplomatic figure who suddenly seemed like there was more to her than we understood, and there just wasn't much talked about her. So she seemed like an important figure who hadn't gotten her due. That's what got me started on the whole project. And as I've been working in the area, I just grew more and more interested. And sorry, I know this is a very long answer, but it culminates in this kind of amazing turn. I finished The Peacemakers, and then I moved on. I was going to do something else, and I was working on a different project. And I suddenly turned to my wife one day I was sitting at the table. I turned to my wife, and she kind of looked at me, and I said, "You know what?" She said, "Yes." I said, "This is very interesting what I'm doing, but what I really want to do is write a biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and I would love to do it for Penguin." I don't know why I said that, but I did say it just like that. And she looked at me, nodded in sympathy, and basically told me to get back to work. And so that's what I did. I sort of started to work in. And about a week or so later, I got an email out of the blue from Penguin, which said, "Would you like to write a biography of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit?" And I just took that as a cosmic sign, and here we are. So
Serendipity.
Yeah.
That's very interesting to hear, sir. And just makes me think that you mentioned that writing this book, you had to do a lot of detective and research work. So can we say that Mrs. Pandit was also a prey of the great man theory of history? Like the notes and the research work about her was not exhaustive enough to really write, and a lot of research work needed to be done.
The great men theory of history, yes, focuses on men, and but let's just be clear that the marginalization of women exists in many fields of history and other fields of scholarship. Not just the ones who are focused on great men, but even
Right.
some of the other stuff that claims to want to think about other kinds of people and figures and characters. Movement, even the attention devoted to women is still, I think, less than it should be. So that the short answer again is yes. There's overall scholarly blinders to the important contributions of women, much like, as I write in the book, women's unpaid labor in the home is often undervalued. We see the same sort of thing multiplied, maximized, as we look at their contributions to world events. But that's only part of the picture with Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, because there's also this additional thing, and I know we'll probably get to talking about this a bit later, but she ultimately clashes with her niece, Indira Gandhi, and Indira Gandhi eventually comes back to power. We can talk about the whole episode later, but she comes back to power, and she never forgives her aunt for what she has done, and she goes about sort of systematically erasing her from the public record. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Anand Bhavan, which is the house Vijay Lakshmi grew up in, and made many important contributions to during her lifetime. And if you go there now, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit doesn't even exist. She's there in 2 pictures, very marginally, something along those lines, 2 pictures, 3 pictures, whatever it might be, but it's very minimal. And that's emblematic of the fact that this house where she was supremely important, which she ran for some time, she's little more than a ghost.
And you're referring to Swaraj Bhavan, I'm guessing, the original Anand Bhavan. Swaraj.
Yeah, well, yes. Swaraj Bhavan and Anand Bhavan sort of together make up this museum complex today,
Yep,
which you
yep.
can visit. But she was in both of those properties.
Yep.
But that's turned into a museum, and over which Indira Gandhi had some oversight. And the representation, at least in that museum, is that she's sort of barely visible.
Right. And I think this becomes especially apparent in the photograph about the Bombay session of the Congress, right, where we have this famous picture of Nehru and Gandhi having a word with each other in a lighter moment and lighter vein. And many years later, we find that Max Jesfor's original photograph actually had Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and it seems like she was actually the one telling a joke while the others were listening in and laughing on the joke, right? So, yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the marginalization of sorts. Coming to her early life, I think she grew up obviously in a very influential household, grew up as Motilal Nehru's second child, eldest daughter. So obviously she rubbed shoulders with the who's who of Indian politics of today. An interesting episode which doesn't find a lot of mention now is her alliance with Syed Hussain, and eventually the Mahatma stepping in, and the Mahatma actually vociferously opposing the marriage, primarily because Syed Hussain was a Mohammedan. In fact, when she eventually gets married to Ranjit Pandit, the Mahatma even proposes that they adopt celibacy because that was what he was advocating a lot those days. So Vijay Lakshmi Pandit and the Mahatma really did not hit off in the early years. Could you probably explain how their trajectory evolved over time?
Sure. So Vijay Lakshmi Pandit grew up in this kind of amazing household. Anand Bhavan's the home, but led by Motilal, and with an incredible cast of characters, sort of the biggest of which was her brother Jawaharlal when he comes back. But there are all kinds of people move in and out, British officials, local Indian officials, nationalists, and so on. And eventually Gandhi comes into the picture. Gandhi, in comparison to these other figures, is not impressive to her at all. He sort of doesn't fit the picture of what all these everyone else is sort of grand in their way, and he's not grand. He's sort of the opposite of grand. And so just character-wise, the way he talks, his movements, and all these things, they're strikingly different than all the people she's used to. But then when he personally intervenes with Motilal and Jawaharlal during her marriage to Syed Hussain. So she gets married to Syed. So should I don't know,
Yeah.
do you want to explain this a little bit?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Go on.
So, she's a young woman. She's only 19. And she falls in love with this person who's working for her father's newspaper. He's incredibly handsome and brilliant, and also he has a way with words. So given who she is and who she turns out to be, you can see why she would be charmed by someone like him, because he was really very much like her in so many ways, and has all had very similar characteristics. So she falls for him, and they elope and they go get married. And then when they reveal this to the family is just apoplectic. Motilal really hits the roof. And so ultimately they ship them off to Gandhi's ashram. And there Gandhi sort of convinces them that they need to separate. Well, he doesn't, he sort of forces them into separation. And then she's not known as Vijay Lakshmi Pandit at this point. She's Swarup Nehru. And so they have the marriage annulled. And she stays for a time at Gandhi's ashram, and she writes letters to her very good friend Padmaja Naidu, who's Sarojini's daughter, and in the course of that reveals a lot about what she thinks, and she really doesn't think very highly of Mr. Gandhi. He's, as you said in your summary, he's a recalcitrant conservative to her, and he sort of doesn't understand the modern world. He sort of doesn't understand modern women, and he has very outdated notions of relationships. So she mocks him and has all of these things that go on. At the same time, she comes to experience things in that ashram which she values. And then anyway, the relationship ends. She's back home. She eventually meets Ranjit Pandit in an arrangement, and they move forward and ultimately get married. And it takes a bit of time, but over a couple of years, she gradually sees a different side of Gandhi. She sees value in who he is and what he does. Obviously, this is also the transition. 1919, when this happens, is literally the great pivot year. And Gandhi sort of emerges, his stature rises from that point forward. So obviously, her view of Gandhi begins to alter as he emerges and becomes important on the national stage, and she sees what he's able to do. So she values him as a political operator, as a political kind of visionary. But then something else happens, which is he also starts to grow as a kind of father figure for her, and she comes to have an absolute deep devotion and love for him. As a father figure, she doesn't ultimately change some of her opinions of some of his views, particularly on sex and on marital relationships, but she sees his greatness and comes to appreciate it.
Could you describe a bit more how our relationship with Gandhi evolved also? As in, initially, we see in your book that in the ashram, as you said, she was not accustomed to all these ways of how she was interacting. Like, she came from a very privileged household, and she was not used to all these ways in the ashram and the way she lived earlier. So,
Sure.
how did it actually evolve with Gandhi, and how actually her relationship evolved with Gandhi?
Okay. So again, she grew up in this fanciful household, which it was sort of run a bit like the modern shows, Upstairs, Downstairs, or Downton Abbey. You know, it was a very aristocratic kind of household filled with the finest kinds of clothes and chinas, and they had teams of staff working for them. So she grew up in this ultra elite fashion. And then here comes Gandhi, and he ultimately starts telling them to get rid of these things, and they can't wear these clothes. And then when she goes to stay with him in the same period, she goes to stay with him in the ashram. And in the ashram, he has her even having to do, to get up, eat very simple kinds of food. She has to participate in chores. These are not things that she grew up with or was trained to do. This was eye-opening for her. She didn't like doing it initially, but as, again, he rises in stature over the course of 1920, 21, 22, and then onwards, of course, she realizes what it means. And of course, she and her whole family take the vows to be on his side, to sort of champion the same values. And ultimately, they basically toss out so much of the stuff that's in Anand Bhavan is taken away. Some of it is just tossed out. And they give up all of their fine possessions. It's a very big thing. She does it, her brother does it, her father. Imagine Motilal Nehru, who's one of the, he's not quite ostentatious, isn't the right word, but he's a gregarious kind of person who's showy, flamboyant, and spends his money in big ways. And suddenly, he's not doing that anymore. That's the influence of Gandhi. And this also percolates down even to her wedding with Ranjit Pandit. She's not allowed to have, Gandhi advises not to have the fancy things. Her mother is upset about it, but she gets a special pink khadi sari from that Kasturba herself has sort of woven. And so these kinds of things are charming in their ways, and she sees the value in it. Of course, she's also very young. I mean, we want to be very careful here. You know, when we say this is all Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, sometimes we think in our minds that this is the same person all along. This is a young girl, and a young woman at this point, and she's sort of just seeing a very different thing that she's used to, and she has to come around to this. And I must say, it's surprising to see she comes around to it fairly quickly. And once she does, she really embraces it, mostly wholeheartedly. But we see also after she gets married to Ranjit, they also decide to go on a trip to Europe. And when they go off and they're in Europe, they suddenly they kind of forget what's happening in India, and they go and enjoy themselves at museums and think about spending. And eventually they kind of wake up and say, what are we doing? We can't do this. But that bubble is fun. And so what the point is it isn't a straight line. She moves to it kind of quickly. She sort of embraces Gandhian values, gives up a lot of stuff, but she has regrets, and she kind of wants to still do this for a while because she is young, and she's, but then after that kind of bubble of doubt, on the other side, she's totally committed after that. And then there is no going back until they're on the other side.
So you mentioned her trip to Europe, which is a very good segue to the next question. She never had any formal education, right? So it wasn't formal education, but if you read through your book, you would see that a running thread through the book is she's always interacting with her peers in terms of books, in terms of ideas. When the Munich Pact is being drawn out, she's present there. She's present in Czechoslovakia during the Sudeten crisis, and so on. So, do you think access helped shape her to a large extent, and did access make up for the lack of formal education that she had?
Well, let me first just correct one thing here, which is, just recently, in fact, I saw all over X, formerly known as Twitter.
Yes, precisely. Yes, I know.
Yeah, several troll accounts were posting.
I know it. That's precisely why I'm asking this question.
Yeah. Yeah, who is not educated, and she just got all these positions. So let's just state very clearly here that, first of all, young girls at that time, particularly young elite women, very frequently did not go to school. And the fathers who were in control of these kinds of issues did not even bother to think about education for young girls. Very frequently, not always, obviously, there were exceptions, but in this particular case, Motilal didn't give it the same amount of thought that he gave to Jawaharlal's education. However, what he did do was get her private tutors. And private tutors, I think it's wrong to say she didn't have a formal education. Private tutors was like the most elite form of education possible. And she had fantastic private tutors who tutored her in very substantial things. She wrote essays about what was going on in Ireland when she was quite young, and that about Terence McSweeney, for example. And this is something that really stuck with her. And much later, when she becomes the ambassador to Ireland, she's still talking about this stuff that she had learned when she was young. So let's just be clear that she did, in fact, receive quite a phenomenal formal education. Now, it might not be through institutions, but it was through these grand tutors, and that it was substantial. In addition to that, and I think this is what you're asking, is that Anand Bhavan had this absolutely phenomenal library. And Jawaharlal, when he had grown up there, had made notes in the margins as he was reading. So when she would read the books in the context of her tutors, she was often in conversation with the tutor, with the words on the page, and in her mind with her brother, her absent brother, who by that point gone abroad to study. And she was interacting with these different kinds of ideas. And all of this definitely informs her in a very substantial way. So she's got excellent training from these tutors. B, she's surrounded by books which she reads all the time. She's extraordinarily well read. There's no question about that at all. Yep. And she reads and she learns in different languages. She reads in different languages. And so all of this is not disputed by anyone. This is extremely clear. And then on top of that, and this is, I think, the other part of what you're asking about, yes, in the house itself, when she's young, she's surrounded by all of these people. So she's constantly learning from the conversations in the house. And then once she starts becoming a figure in her own right, and as an adult, she begins to travel the world. She finds herself in all of these places. And because of who she is, she winds up encountering, speaking about, and engaging with these people as well. So she learns from life. She learns from those around her, the kind of environment that she finds herself in. She learns from the books that she grows up with, and she constantly acquires new ones, which she's also reading, even when she's in prison. All of her time, she has 3 stints in prison, and in each of those, she just gets books and just is sitting there plowing through specific works of literature. And so anyway, all of these things combined, I think, reveals someone who is, in fact, quite extraordinarily well-educated, which we see reflected later in her career. And we can talk about that and how who she goes up against, who she's able to defeat in debate, and the acknowledgement she receives from other brilliant people about how smart, in fact, she is.
Just it came to my mind is you in the earlier chapters you talk extensively about Motilal Nehru as well. As in, I mean, in popular form of history, we don't really see much of Motilal Nehru, and as you said, his gregarious nature and how he was influential in the life of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. And you mentioned like quite in detail about Motilal Nehru as well, which I feel is also somewhat missing in many chapters of history. Could you just share your thought how you came to, I mean, picture that as well in your book?
Well, I think when one writes a biography, I mean, there are many choices that you have to make. A life, one thing I discovered in doing this is, we exist in one way in our minds. If we close our eyes, we sort of think about ourselves in a particular fashion. And perhaps that fashion of ourselves is very consistent. But as we encounter everything in life, each person has an impression of us. And so we exist in those people's minds as well. It's only that comprehensive thing which provides the full picture. So why does Motilal Nehru appear in this book in the way that he does? Well, he's her father. He's very influential in her life. He holds a lot of meaning for her. And so for his views of his child, his views of what happens in the family, and then its reflection and refraction through her, reflection on, through, and by her, and refraction through, and as refracted by her as well, Motilal has to feature in the book. So that's the reason why he's there. Now, in terms of why he would be absent, I just think that, there have been many fantastic scholarly historians of India and of South Asia as a region more broadly. And there have been also a number of prominent writers who write for a broader public who've also been fantastic. And the field overall has accomplished many things. But there's and this shouldn't surprise anyone. There's always so much more to do. And in a sense, we're also a very young kind of field and profession. And so there are, I think we're at the cusp of this point of people now bringing in a whole bunch of new things and ideas and focusing in on new people, underrepresented figures. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit is one. That's what I've written about. But there are other biographies which have just been released. For example, on Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, on Sheikh Abdullah, and many more are on their way. There's also a new one on Tilak, for example. And so I think there's a recent one on VP Menon. Anyway, the point is there's a whole bunch of things we need to know much more about. And as new scholars, younger scholars and older ones as well, produce work, and as we sort of explore this new pathways, biography being one, and I'm proud to be one of the pioneers of this, I think we'll learn more about all of these underrepresented figures, and not just them, but then that's going to help us rethink and re-understand historical narratives as well.
One of the running threads through Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's life is her work for the All India Women's Conference. So there are regular intermissions after which she returns to her work there, and that's a passionate cause that she strongly espouses. Through the course of her life, she has seen the AIWC espouse very, very elite concerns, work on elite concerns, to a complete transformation in its outlook where it focuses on the downtrodden, focusing on the lowest strata of the society. If you could briefly outline her work for AIWC and the kind of people who influenced her along the way.
Okay. So the All India Women's Conference is an organization which gets off the ground in India, led by elite women, but in conversation with a Western woman named Margaret Cousins and some affiliates of hers. So it's an internationally inspired organization to begin with. It's in conversation with other international organizations, and it's talking about women's upliftment, broadly speaking, and also international peace and justice, which is what many of these organizations are concerned about. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit does get involved from early on, and her concerns, grounded in sort of her affiliation with Gandhi and influence from her brother, are a bit different from some of her peers. They are, her brother sort of talks to her directly about it, which is in the book. They tend to be a bit more, well, they're described as reactionary in some ways, but really just focused on sort of elite concerns. So her early affiliation is that she's a member of this and doesn't have, she's there and she says a bit here and there, but doesn't necessarily sway anything per se. But then something quite important happens, which is Margaret Sanger, who is a very important person in the West, who deals with contraception, and she's worried about birth control and things of this sort. She wants to talk to Gandhi about what he thinks, and she makes this trip to India. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit is one of the people who is influential in that trip. In the course of this, Margaret Sanger is involved with the All India Women's Conference. So Vijaya Lakshmi talking to her and sort of, again, having a kind of important role there is one little spark. We just want to put that spark to the side, because then there's this other thing that happens, which is she gets drawn into actual politics. She serves on the Allahabad Municipal Board, and then eventually runs for and gets a seat and becomes a cabinet minister in the UP government, the first woman cabinet minister to hold substantial portfolios in the British Empire. And the minute that happens, because of the pioneering nature of that breakthrough, obviously that then kind of boomerangs back into increased influence in the All India Women's Conference. She ultimately becomes elected the president of the All India Women's Conference. But over this course of, from the late 30s through the mid-1940s, as her profile increases, she begins to push the All India Women's Conference to say, look, we have to wake up. We can't just be talking to ourselves in the room and patting ourselves on the back and talking to other people who are like us. And the people we're talking about here, like Lady Abdul Qadir and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, these are extremely wealthy, privileged women, and their concerns are somewhat narrow. She herself is extremely wealthy and privileged, or she was anyway. But through her association with Gandhi and her work, she comes to really be concerned with ordinary people and the miseries that they find themselves in. And that's extensively dealt with in the book. That isn't just me trying to give a throwaway line. I've documented how and why she did that. So she has the credentials. She has a track record where she's actually done the work and where people have responded to her. And she brings those concerns to the All India Women's Conference and pushes them to kind of think differently and to open up their to open up the direction of the organization and to rethink their roles.
So taking a cue from that, so in her professional career, when she got the opportunity of being the president at the United Nations General Assembly, so did her like her vision of the world government, did it inform her choices, and how did it influence and how did it help her to really to put her views in the United Nations General Assembly? Could you share some light on that?
Sure. So I won't get into all the details here, but basically her brother and Gandhi had many conversations about internationalist politics, which evolved into a commitment to a form of world government, and she adhered to that vision as well. She evolved and adhered to that vision. I do want to be clear that some of her ideas were they developed independently outside of her brother and Gandhi, and then in fact fed back into their own kinds of conclusions. So I don't want it to seem like it's one way from them to her. She's very much part of the contribution of that conversation. So that's when we talk about world government, where the term that they used was one world. But this is what it basically meant. So the United Nations was the institution that they saw as the foundation for any kind of world government to evolve from. And so when she becomes the first woman president of the UN General Assembly in the early 1950s, your question basically is then how does she bring this vision of world government to this position, and what does she try to push it? I think I would respond this way. She puts her foot on the gas very gently. Like this is the middle of the Cold War. There are many controversial things happening, the biggest of which is the Korean War. And there's a real fear, there's constant fear of things spiraling out of control, of nuclear annihilation. And so, she held to idealistic visions, like this is a good thing to believe in, but she was very practical, just like her brother. And it wasn't very practical to be saying let's form and forge a world government when they were also worrying about everyone tearing themselves apart and destroying the whole world. So I think the way to think about this, the language she uses is that she's a citizen of the world. She's a world citizen. And she says that explicitly. That's again, that's documented. Those are her words on the record. When she's elected, she says, they ask her about her and her country and so on, and she says, "Look, in this position, my role is to think of myself as, and I do, as a citizen of the world, so I am advocating based on that for these things." And so world citizenship is obviously something that's also linked to principles of world governance and so on. And so she saw the value in that language. She saw the value in that kind of vision, but she also saw the realities of the world. And she was always very, very careful to take steps as needed. So in this case, very, very, very small steps and in very practical ways. And that's what she focused her presidency on. So to boil all of that down into a simple soundbite, how much did she devote or think about world government while she was president of the United Nations? I'd say probably not much.
At the United Nations, I think we can focus on some of the debates, historic debates that she took part in. Obviously, the one with Jan Smuts comes to mind. there's a running link here, right? So she's learned the ropes of legislative politics at the UP provincial assemblies. Did those experiences help shape her as a debater? Where do you think she learned the ropes? Which was the playing ground where she learned the ropes to be a great debater? Which let her exchange barbs with Jan Smuts eventually, Winston Churchill a lot during the Bengal famine. Obviously, Winston Churchill and she had a rapprochement of sorts later in the day. But yeah,
Well, as I show in the book, she she has a sharp tongue from the time that she's very, very young. When she's just a child, she is able to throw out barbs, and she's very quick-witted also. So she debates even with her tutors. She debates in the form of essays. She has a long dialogues with members of her household, those close to her, and obviously many detailed conversations and debates with her brother, who's whatever the people say today or whatever one's views of his particular politics was widely considered and should rightly so as brilliant. And
yes,
so he and she would debate philosophically on many things. And her husband also was brilliant and a scholar.
a scholar in
Uh,
his own right. Yep.
and then on top of that, her children were brilliant. You know, the middle daughter, she has three daughters. The middle daughter grows up to become one of India's most celebrated writers, Nayanthara Sehgal. And so, you know, these brilliant children, I mean, I don't want to, that doesn't take anything away from the other two sisters, Chandralekha and Rita, who were also quite incredible and did big things. So all of them, this whole family setting is constantly, you know, she's constantly in conversation and debates all along. So that's one part of it. And so she has natural talent, which we see from the time she's a child. She grows up in the right environment where she's surrounded by this kind of thing. And then, yes, absolutely, she joins politics where she immediately stands out because she's a woman surrounded by men, and she even like that's how do I put this charitably? The ones who try to be chivalrous, let's say, she has to deal with them. That's a different kind of misogyny that she has to deal with. And then there's the ones who are outright.
Just interrupting you here. So I think what you're referring to here is most of the reports that would detail her speeches at the United Nations would focus on her sartorial choices as much as the words she deployed in those speeches. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's at the UN, but even when she's working at the municipal board level, she has a staff. Many of the men really like her and admire her, but then the way that they treat her, you know, is not something that she's particularly fond of either. Even the ones who like her, and then the ones who are opposed to her, I mean, they behave terribly. And so in all of these, she has to sort of find her way through navigate her way through all of these things, and figure out how to deal with all of these people, to get what she wants, to kneecap the right ones, but also to not do that to most people. That's her magic. Her magic is that she's basically all wit and charm. So she's warm, she's funny, she's hard-tongued, it's true, but her goal is to kind of win people over, not to just sort of destroy them verbally. And so she sort of wins friends wherever she goes, even as she kind of opposes people for bad beliefs or outdated practices. And so, yes, by the time she gets to the United Nations, by the time she faces off against this really, you know, famous statesman with very problematic white supremacist views, that's Jan Smuts of South Africa, by the time she gets to facing off against him, she's had a lot of practice. She's had a lot of practice dealing with men with problematic views. And she continues to have a wonderfully warm relationship with him. They stand off together at the parties. They battle. So sorry, I don't want to get into this until you're ready to, but 19 46. She's at the United Nations. They're debating a South African law known as the Ghetto Act. And its negative impact on people in South Africa. She's going up against him, and she's the lead force against him. But at all of the parties for months, the two of them were often seen off to the side together, chit-chatting warmly, and they had a very good personal relationship. So it wasn't personal animus, and that's true of his view of her and her view of him. But he was the one doing the terrible thing. So it doesn't speak as highly of him as it does of her. That she's willing to talk to him in a very polite way. Of course, she was instructed to do so by Gandhi as well, but she had this warm relationship. And then at the same time, in all public settings, she was unafraid and insistent that she say what needs to be said. And she did it successfully. She took him down at the United Nations.
I remember I first heard of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit in school, but to be honest, I did not really hear that she was Jawaharlal Nehru's sister. In fact, I knew her like as a president of the United Nations General Assembly, but there is the mammoth personality of Jawaharlal Nehru like as a brother. So, could you just throw some light on how her relationship with her brother panned, and how that trajectory was, and what sort of relationship they had, and were there ups and downs? How was it?
Outside of her marriage to Ranjit Pandit and her children, I would say that her relationship with her brother was probably the single most important relationship in her whole life. She idolized him. He was a titanic figure in her life. He was her older brother, and she just looked up to him and admired him deeply, loved him beyond belief, and was also perhaps a bit too clingy. She had a very close and tight-knit relationship with him. So when he initially got married to Kamla Nehru, the person known as Kamla Nehru, she has a bit of a frosty relationship with her sister-in-law. This is fairly well documented, and what I book is I sort of spell it out a bit and explain from her perspective as well as from others what was the nature of that relationship and why it went wrong. She herself confesses that it wasn't perfect and that she made many mistakes. She didn't feel like Kamla was sort of fit in, and she, sort of was very big and gregarious, and Kamla was much more withdrawn. But that also has to do with the fact that she was so close to her brother, and that kind of navigating that again at that early part of her life was one of her big challenges. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that she also had some positive elements to her relationship with Kamla, and that also I show in the book. It wasn't always all just mistakes or misfires. I mean, they did work together and do things. And she maintained this very close relationship with him all the way through the point at which she becomes world famous and becomes this sort of titanic figure on the world stage. And then something rather shocking happens, which is that this person who had also been important in London for some time and had initially been quite endearing towards her, a well-known figure in India, V.K. Krishna Menon, I don't know, he becomes the Svengali on the scene, and he or how do I put this? The Rasputin on the scene.
Rasputin on the scene, yes. That's very likely.
Not Svengali, sorry. The Rasputin on the scene is the right word. And he kind of mesmerizes Nehru. And Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, just for the life of her, cannot understand what is going on. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Menon emerges as her nemesis, and does succeed in pushing her out, and closing ranks around Nehru and capturing his ear over hers for a period of time. And then I can come back. You want to talk? I don't know if you want to talk about Menon here.
It's actually
Yeah,
useful to
sure.
talk about Menon because this is a question which I think even Jairam Ramesh in his book has addressed to some extent. It would be good to understand your perspectives on why there was this almost apparent intellectual surrender on Nehru's part towards V.K. Krishna Menon till 1962 and the China War. Yeah, what are your views on it?
Yeah, I think it's, well, I think there's a change a bit before the China War, a little bit before, but yes, I mean, that's the big pivot point for sure. Well, let's be clear. Krishna Menon was brilliant and immensely talented. Again,
Yes.
that's unquestionable. He had his hand in many different fields and disciplines, and was successful at basically all of these different things in the world of literature, for example. He played a big role. And he also had his charms. So especially when he was younger, he was able to do all these things. One only needs to look at Krishna Menon's papers just to see how rapidly this man's mind worked. Because, I mean, his papers are voluminous. His letters are endless, and they're so, like, long-winded, which, of course, he was also famous for these long-winded speeches. So he was all of those things. But he was impulsive, he was arrogant, he was neurotic, and he was egotistical, and beyond all of those things, he was convinced of, he was sort of narcissistic. He was convinced of his own supreme brilliance. And he just thought he was better than most other people and that they would get things wrong. They didn't have his talent. Now, it's true he was talented. It was true he was brilliant. But these other kinds of conclusions that he came to about himself also, I think, weakened him. Why were Nehru and Menon so close is, I will leave this to Sunil Kilnani. I hope we'll spell this out finally in the big biography he's working on, big project he's working on Nehru.
Okay.
But I think from my point of view, what I see is that Nehru was also kind of brilliant and isolated. And he appreciated the fact that Menon was brilliant. So they sort of had a certain kind of camaraderie. They both appreciated each other at that level, that they were both sort of super sophisticated in their way of thinking. There was kind of a leftist resonance. They both kind of agreed on many kinds of
Fabian socialism.
basic principles. All of those things are true. And then I think there's something a bit more to it. I mean, I think Nehru also felt that isolated and the world didn't completely understand him, but he also needed, I mean, and we want to be objective as well. And Nehru was someone who needed, like most people do, to sometimes hear from other people he liked to hear about how good he was, how great he was. I think that's a fair enough thing to say. And I think Menon sort of massaged that point consistently and constantly, and that made Nehru feel good. So I think that there's all of those elements which I think go into this. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, who also was very fond of Nehru and said many kind things to him, was unafraid of contradicting him and going against him and debating and saying, I don't agree with you and you're wrong. So that's one thing. Secondly, she's his sister. And Nehru would always sort of downplay these things as sort of sibling affection. Menon, Nehru said, Nehru sort of saw him as a bit of an outsider and perhaps more objective. But let me just clarify here and just to be as, the work I was looking at was about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and from her point of view, which I do elaborate on in the book, she never can understand it. She has no idea what the stranglehold is that Menon has over her brother. And she writes about, tells him, what could it possibly be? I can't understand. Like, how does this man have this hold on you? And why are you so blind to his problems? Because he has very serious problems, which he did. He had serious mental health issues, which were manifesting at the United Nations and costing India on various kinds of things. And Nehru was blind to it. And so she was warning him in these letters. She was telling him in person, in private, and he just wouldn't hear it until finally, at the end, she sort of finally broke through, and eventually she ices Menon. Eventually things sort of change, and he's pushed out, but then he winds up becoming defense minister. That has catastrophic consequences. Then finally he's diminished, and then lo and behold, the funny circle of history. After Nehru dies, and Vijay Lakshmi has a different kind of role to play, she becomes a critic of the government, and the one person who is on her side turns out to be Krishna Menon.
Krishna Menon, yes. Worth exploring the third sibling who is probably left out in most of these conversations, which is Krishna Hutheesing, affectionately referred to as Betty. So whatever little sense we get from your book and from reading history in general is she feels like that neglected third sibling who didn't have much of her own accomplishments to write home about, and that led to a sense of resentment in her. So what do you think?
Well, yes, I mean, that's exactly kind of the story. Betty, who Krishna eventually marries Raja Hutheesing, comes to be known as Krishna Hutheesing. But within the circles, within the family, she's known as Betty. Well, first, let me say one thing before I get into Betty, because Betty's story tells us something very important about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. One of the criticisms of Nehru is that, look at the nepotism. He brings Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in and places her, and she's not qualified, and blah, blah. And the flip side of the same story is, look at Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, she's a product of nepotism, and she is not really qualified. Well, the story of Betty tells us that these things are not true.
Yep.
Because he loved both of his siblings equally. He writes about that passionately. They all believe they're very close to him. Betty writes about her love for her brother. So there is no real gap between the love between the two sisters and the brother. But Betty does not ever move into public service successfully the way that her sister does. And that tells you, firstly, about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, that her success is due to both nature and nurture, right? It's her own nature as well as the environment. Betty grows up in the same environment, just a bit behind Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, and it doesn't have the same impact on her. And she doesn't break through in the same way. So one, it tells us this much about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. It also tells us about Nehru and nepotism, because he's not delivering these kinds of benefits to his other sister. Now, from Betty's perspective, well, one thing we could say is, well, maybe Betty doesn't want these things. Maybe Krishna Hutheesing, but I think there's an element of truth to that, and then there's an element of not truth to that, because we see through her writings and her actions that she does in fact grow quite bitter, that she is not as famous as her sister. It's not so much about her brother, it's really about her sister. Her ire is kind of consistently directed at her sister. And she belittles her in public sometimes. She makes little side remarks. Sometimes she's the source of bad press. They have a good relationship, but they also have like sibling rivalry. And Krishna Hutheesing also develops some mental health issues, which she has to deal with. I don't say these things to take anything away from her. And one of the most important, I think, elements of my book that I wish people would take away from reading it is Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit herself goes through numerous health issues, including mental health issues. And so I think the big thing for me is that talking about needs, including mental health, should be normalized. People will often, they themselves will stigmatize mental health issues or feel like society stigmatizes these things. And therefore, they feel very isolated and alone and unable or unwilling to talk about these things for fear of rejection by their friends, family, or society. And one of the things I hope my book does for people who read it or listen to this podcast at least is that they feel seen. That even people like Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, Krishna Hutheesing from this preeminent family, people of tremendous achievement, that they struggled with these things too. And at various times in their lives, they needed help. And so it is not unusual. In fact, it is extremely common for people to have, to need mental health support, to have mental health needs. And what people should, I hope, feel seen and heard in this book, and also encouraged to seek out the help that they might need when they need it. So sorry for that side thing, but that is one thing that's very important to me, and that's one of the elements of what I put into the writing of the book that I hope does come through in the telling of these stories. Now, Krishna Hutheesing had these difficulties which she had to grapple with in her life, and that does come through in the formal writing that she did, and also in the kind of more passive things that she would throw away in comments or in letters or whatever. So in a nutshell, that's her story. But she also, maintained look, families are complicated, as we all know. And so, yes, she did those things, but she continued, and Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, to her, continued to have an affectionate relationship. So it was affectionate, and it was, they argued, and they sometimes didn't get along, and then they got along. I mean, it's like every family. Yeah. That's a healthy sign to me. You know why? Because it tells you, A, that these were real people with real problems.
Yep.
And they were also like everybody else.
Exactly.
It makes them more relatable.
This perspective is very interesting. The mental health, I think we often miss out when we see these characters, that they are real people just like us, and
Made up
that
of
is,
flesh and blood. Exactly. We
yes,
tend
yes,
to
and
think of them as some.
yes,
Yeah.
it's very interesting perspective. So, sir, based on that, I wanted to ask you, what was thinking is her relationship with another famous personality is Indira Gandhi. So, I mean, it comes across that she adored her niece during her childhood days and was fond of her. But then, as I read and I understand that while she was traveling to London with her daughter Nayantara, then she discovers in 1975 the famous emergency. So what Indira Gandhi, I mean, and Indira Gandhi comes across as someone whoever comes in her way, she comes across as that figure of crushing and having a powerful leader. As so, just wanted to understand your thoughts that how that relationship ultimately panned out and how did it affect Vijay Lakshmi Pandit in that aspect.
Okay, so you've already in your question summarized the most important takeaway, which is that there's been this long-standing canard put forward, quite frankly, by none other than Indira Gandhi herself, that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, from the time Indira Gandhi was a child, was the villain of the house. That she hated Indira Gandhi, that she said nasty things to her, that she belittled her, that she treated her mother poorly, and that they always had this bad relationship. That's false. It's some elements are what. Let me say that in a big way is false. But now let me also put some caveats to that false there's some truth, some elements of truth. The first is, by her own admission and others, she had a fraught relationship with Kamla. It wasn't necessarily totally intentional. They were both young. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit was a very young woman, and going through her own kinds of challenges at the time. And so there were things which she developed regret for later. She talks openly about the regrets. And there were some things like that going on. And so it is believable and understandable, so I would say truthful, that the young Indira Nehru, would see these things and be hurt by them, worry about her mother, and sort of wonder what's going on between the aunt and her mother, and obviously side with the mother in those questions. They're totally believable. I think it is also true, the famous quip that Vijay Lakshmi once said, that when Indira Gandhi was very young, that this was a person without either beauty or brains. This is via Popal Jayakar and so on, this famous quote about Indira Gandhi. It's true, but it isn't exactly the way people would sort of believe that. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that people conclude and say, how awful. Indira Gandhi, Vijay Lakshmi said kind of barbed things all the time because she was very kind of straightforward about it. But then there was also an affection behind it, which taken out of context, can mean something entirely different. And in context, what we see is someone who deeply cares about Indira Nehru, who throws birthday parties for her. Indira Nehru is extremely close to Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's children. They play together. She writes lovingly about her, and in many instances, says explicitly that she thinks she's beautiful, that she thinks she's brilliant, all of these things. So I don't think it is fair to say that these two other episodes dominate the entire story. Moreover, we know also that Vijay Lakshmi, when she's High Commissioner of London, helps out Indira Gandhi's children, particularly Rajiv Gandhi with his schooling needs, and Indira Gandhi is very grateful. And we also see affection from Indira Gandhi to her aunt in this period as well. So quite late, this is through the 1950s. She's writing very affectionately, and she says that she is phenomenal. She's retiring from this position, beloved, and all of this stuff. And there's no reason for her to write it if she hates her in the way that she later seems to kind of rewrite history to claim that she did. So I would say that the takeaway of all of this is they had a positive relationship. What ends up happening, though, is that after Nehru dies, they both emerge as important figures, and Lal Bahadur Shastri becomes the prime minister, and the press begins to sort of wonder who's going to do what, who's going to rise up, and they pitch them. We see this in the press today. We see this in the Western press. We see this in the Indian press. The press, they kind of look for stories, and what's a better story than who's going to be more important, the aunt, the world famous aunt, or this daughter who's, got the mantle of the father. So it's, of course, if you just say the sentence, you realize, look at the drama in this story. Who wouldn't want to know about it? Who wouldn't want to read about it? Who wouldn't want to write about it? So you leap to that thing. That's exactly what happened. And everyone is very keen to know what's going on. And so they pitch them as opposing camps.
Popular media.
The media and all, the elites talking about it, and it filters down in all kinds of ways. And ordinary people are thinking and talking about it. It doesn't have to just filter down. They're also wondering. The thing is that Indira Gandhi also has issues. She is paranoid and thin-skinned, and some of this begins to eat at her right from this point forward. So the traits and characteristics which we think of when we think of the emergency, and some of her less fine qualities, those start to appear here. She begins to see enemies, and the number one enemy in her mind is her aunt. She begins to believe some of these stories. Now, they put out stories denying all of this stuff, but it poisons Indira Gandhi's mind. And she begins to wonder if her aunt is actually manipulating things behind the scenes and trying to push her out and trying to emerge as the prime minister and trying to pull down the government. She starts to panic about all these things. Now, eventually, as everyone knows, Lal Bahadur Shastri dies, and through a series of events involving the syndicate and others, Indira Gandhi emerges as the prime minister. And from that position, now she's free to be more explicit with her aunt. So there's some questions, what's going to happen with Vijay Lakshmi now that Indira Gandhi is the prime minister, and something happens right out of the gate, which is, as she's wont to do, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit isn't all roses when she speaks. She's sort of fair in her criticism. She says, well, yeah, I mean, this is good that she's, but I'm wondering, and that little bit of doubt in her response is all Indira Gandhi needs to hear to say she's against me. And that is it. And she can't ever get past it after that. She tells her directly at some point, Pupi, I don't trust you. She says it to her face, to Vijay Lakshmi's face. And Vijay Lakshmi responds by being glad about it, saying, "Good, finally, you said it. Now we can deal with it." They try to still express personal affection, but it was out in the open by that point. So what happens is this fracture about doubt about each other's role in the public sphere and whether they were trying to malign one another. Vijay Lakshmi, for her part, as far as I can tell, in all of the records I saw, all the private correspondence, anything, maintained a personal affection for Indira Gandhi. She was bewildered by what was happening. She did not feel the same way. She continued to have great affection for her. She did have questions about certain actions or certain policies, which she did about her brother. Like she was consistent also about saying, look, I love you, but I disagree with you. And I'm going to tell you to your face, or I'm going to say like what I think in public. That was who she was. So anyway, all of that leads to this fracture. 1975, the emergency, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit and Nayanthara are abroad. They come back and discover the country under emergency, and Vijay Lakshmi is placed under house arrest. Here,
we can probably finish the loop with her campaigning against Indira Gandhi and effectively campaigning for the Janta Party. We can probably keep going.
Yeah. Right. So Vijay Lakshmi is under house arrest. She stays there for most of the duration of what we know of as the emergency. But the reason there is this duration for the emergency is because of the actions of this family, which is Nayanthara is abroad and using a pseudonym, Azad, meaning freedom. She produces a story in the United States about how India has gone wrong and what Indira Gandhi has done. That sets off a firestorm in the US. Vijay Lakshmi knows that it's her daughter who has done this. And that's the spark that she needs. She suddenly feels very guilty. She's like, what have I been doing? She's sort of been in stupor for, a year and a half or so. And she's like, what am I doing? I can't be silent. Everything we fought for is under threat. And I can't live out my days like this. And so she gives a newspaper interview, comes out swinging, and declares to the world that her niece is a threat to democracy and a threat to India, and she must oppose her. And then this sets off again that fuels the fire in the West. Many of Indira Gandhi's friends themselves level criticism against her. And then for mysterious reasons that we don't quite totally understand, we have some speculation. Nirja Chowdhury has some insight into this in her book as well. The book is How Prime Ministers Decide, the journalist Nirja Chowdhury. But Indira Gandhi essentially just calls off the emergency and stands for election. We believe she thinks she thought she was going to win. There's some, all kinds of analysis about this, which I don't need to get into here. The point is she terminates the emergency and puts herself up for an election. And then Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. So I think popular narratives are, she's part of the coalition, but there are, it's sort of these other figures who are more important than her, JP and others. But that's not what I found. I found, in fact, she was the star campaigner. She was the VIP campaigner against her aunt. And she led the charge against her. That's the conclusion of other. That's not my conclusion. That's in writing that she's the VIP campaigner. She draws electric crowds. She campaigns all over the place. She works together with Atal Bihari Vajpayee on the right and JP on the other side to have this big, broad coalition against Indira Gandhi, and she also has a popular touch. She draws the crowds. There's a picture in my book of her addressing a rally, and it's huge. It's a big rally. So she has all of this. She marshals all of that against her aunt, and ultimately in India's hour of need, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, who's retired by that point, comes out of retirement to save democracy and defeat authoritarianism. It's a very powerful moment. It's how I end the book. And then as an epilogue, of course, I talk about Indira Gandhi's return and the consequences that Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit faces for what she did.
One question about Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's view on international policy. So the consensus in India, in Delhi, till that point of time had been that India would be non-aligned, but would be somewhat Soviet, Russo-centric, would be deeply interested in central planning, in the deep statist form of planning an economy. We see Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit being quite different in that aspect because she has a very pan-American outlook towards her international policy, and she can be considered an Americophile in some form or shape, maybe not explicitly, but definitely more than her peers, which include her brother, Jawaharlal Nehru. How did she develop this intellectual bent? Because growing up, she was only exposed to Fabian socialism in trovs, but how did she actually end up embracing capitalist USA in some form or shape?
So she herself was influenced by Fabian socialism, leftist thought. And to be clear, in several episodes throughout her life, including after she became famous, she found herself to the left of her brother. So let's just be clear that whatever her affection for the United States was, she maintained sort of deep progressive values. I don't know that I necessarily always put them on a clear-cut ideological spectrum, but describing them as progressive values is I think the right way to describe. Meaning, I don't think we would necessarily say these are committed leftist positions in this kind of strict ideological way, but we would say that these are progressive positions. And sometimes they were strictly ideological as well. I mean, she did have those kinds of things too. Okay, so one is I'd say that that's true. That she is to the left of her famously leftist brother in several important occasions. The difference, though, is that between them, he was a brilliant orator and had many fine qualities, as we all know, but I don't think even he could match her charm. She just was relentlessly charming wherever she went. And her outlook, her practice was to charm and get along with whoever was in the room. So she was equally comfortable having a meal with ordinary people, and ordinary people in India, or ordinary people in the United States, or ordinary people in Russia, or ordinary people in the United Kingdom. Wherever she was equally comfortable with ordinary people, and she was also equally comfortable with the elitist of the elitist of the elite, whoever we're talking about, whether they were monarchs or they were presidents or they were whoever, or princes. she moved easily in those circles as well. And that ability to sort of read the room, to move between different circles or to code switch, we might say, that was a real talent. So let's put all of that on the table before we say, how did she develop this thing for the United States? I think she developed this thing for the United States because her daughters went to Wellesley.
Yep.
And her youngest daughter went to Putney, and then some other schooling also in the US. And she herself came at this pivotal moment in her life right after Vijaya Lakshmi came, right after her husband had died. And then she comes to the United States sort of distraught, and her children are there. That makes her feel better. Lo and behold, Syed Hussein is there.
Yep.
And that kind of makes her feel good. And she receives a rapturous reception. They love her in the United States, and they catapult her to a different kind of fame altogether than she's had. She's already famous. She's world famous by the time she comes to the United States, but now she transcends that into this kind of super celebrity that, I mean, really only celebrities have. And that's, how can I say that? Let me give you 3 quick examples to prove that point. One, when she's in the United States and she goes to San Francisco for the founding of the United Nations in 1945. This is her first tour of the United States. First tour. She's sitting in a cafe in San Francisco. There's a window. People see her in the window. They get very excited. They come into this restaurant and they mob her table asking for autographs, and seated right next to her is Hollywood legend James Cagney. And no one is paying any attention to him. So that's one example of how incredibly popular it was. The second would be that Marlon Brando, when he is coming off of the high of his greatest achievements on the waterfront, Julius Caesar, he's asked by a newspaper who he admires most in the world, and he says, her, which is quite extraordinary. And then the third is that there are polls taken about who are the most admired women in the world. And from the point that she becomes ambassador to the United States in the late 1940s and then forward, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, basically for the rest of her public career, has a spot on that list, the top 10 list of most admired women in the world. So this is someone who is beloved in the United States. People tell her that to her face. The US administrations across presidents tell her, look, we might have a problem with your brother, we might have a problem with your country's policies, but gosh darn it, we love you, and so therefore. And who wouldn't develop an affection for a place when you constantly receive that kind of love? She also saw value, like her daughter did, and writes about when she was making the journey, in some of kind of the simple natures, the kind of different approach of Americans than the old European world. Now, let me also be clear, she also saw the racism in the country, which she opposed, and stood against her, I mean, vocally and privately and publicly. And she also saw ostentatiousness by people, which juxtaposed harshly with some of the conditions in India, which she also kind of always had to grapple with. But yes, I would say that she ultimately, she did describe herself explicitly as someone who had great affection for the United States. And yes, kind of an Americophile or some version of that word she did use explicitly. She also had a not great experience as ambassador to the Soviet Union, which may have contributed to this view. And lastly, I would just say that she didn't have that great an experience in Moscow, not because of who she was, not because she tilted towards Americans at that point. She actually she had a very good relationship. She had a great reception initially in Moscow. But what she couldn't stand was the incredible opacity of the state, the opacity of the state. the willingness to present misinformation, to hide the truth, to not talk openly, to not allow people the sort of free flow of information and ideas, not allow people to talk. She was very critical of that and grew increasingly concerned about it and questioning of it, as she did in a trip to China later. Those things, I think, her wariness of elements of authoritarianism are what I think, she was a committed Democrat. And while she saw the problems and fought against them in the United States, the problems in the United States and fought against them, her commitment to liberty, to personal freedom, to human rights, and to democracy as a prevailing value led her, I think, to have this fondness for at least with the ideals, regardless of the imperial kinds of qualities which she was critical of this place. It's the ideals that I think drew her and that she championed and stood for in her own ways, in more internationalist ways throughout her career.
Yeah, as we are just wrapping up, so sir, can you share something about your next works or any interesting thing you're working on? Something that you can share with us?
Well, I am I have two primary concerns at the moment. One, in terms of my scholarship, I'm working on a short pocket history of India, which I hoping to get done in the coming months. Then my broader concern, which perhaps is reflected in my last answer, is, and which I have been writing about since 2016 in different ways, writing and talking about in different ways, is my broader concern with the growing authoritarian impulses around the world and the threat that they pose to democracy, which is also a value I cherish and wish to champion. So that is something else that I have an interest in and am working on in personal capacities, at least, as well as, of course, through what I can professionally as well. Yeah, I if there is a choice between authoritarianism and democracy, I'm partisan for democracy.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhagwan, for your time today. I would urge all our listeners to pick up your latest book. It's your book on Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. It's an amazingly detailed, very engaging prose, and we have just touched upon some of the different chapters of Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's life to get a fuller sense of the richness that her life encompasses. One should definitely pick up the book and go through it in details. The book has very interesting prose, as I mentioned earlier. What's even more interesting are the footnotes. The footnotes are really a treasure trove. Thank you so much, sir, for putting them together.
Well,
all the best.
I found someone who's read footnotes, so thank you. That's amazing.
Thank you so much, sir, for the book, and all the best for your future endeavors.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck to both of you. Thank you. Good luck with the great podcast.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.